The Baltimore Ravens are sniffing around some offensive line help with pre-draft visits and even some veterans coming into the building. We talk about the latest, the state of the offensive line, and of course, the Ravens draft is almost 2 weeks away. All that and more coming up next on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens. We are your daily Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thank you so much for being here today on this midweek edition of the show, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every day as well. We are free and available on all podcasting platforms. So got you covered in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel, as an audio form wherever you get your podcast. You can follow along and subscribe over there as well. 5 days a week plus more of daily Ravens coverage over here on Locked On Ravens. And we are almost 2 weeks away from the 2025 NFL Draft kicking off. So I am pleased to have back on the show from Film Study Ravens. It is Ken McKusick. Ken, long time no see. Ken and I just finished up a safety preview over on Ken's show. It was a blast talking about the prospects. We went 10 through 1, had some honorable mentions, so be sure you check that out. But Ken, the offseason, there have been plenty of ups and downs for the Ravens so far. It's been busy in some ways, not busy in others. How do you think Baltimore's fared so far?
Yeah, I think they've done well. I think the Ronnie Stanley was the big thing they had to get done. And then if I had a complaint about what's gone on, they have not really made any progress at all yet. Getting signees from among their third-year players who are advancing into year 4, a period of divisible benefit, optionality, and whatnot. Ardarius Washington, Daniel Fa'alele are good choices for guys who are not right at the top of the pay scale and might be willing to take more security for a contract now. The guys they'd really like to get signed are Isaiah Likely, Travis Jones, Tyler Linderbaum, who doesn't have a viable 5th-year option. They actually have another year on Hamilton if they'd like to, but it's been a lot of names have gone out the door again. They've guys who have been kind of priced out of Baltimore in some ways, in particular the inside linebackers Board and Malik Harrison were both, they were given offers that the Ravens weren't going to come close to. So I think it's been a good offseason so far.
I'm really glad you brought up the extensions, or the lack of, for the third year, well, I guess 4th-year guys now, but entering that 4th year, Isaiah Likely, Travis Jones being the 2 big ones. I think at this point, it would have been nice to have 1 or 2 of those done, especially with the draft being just a couple weeks away. Obviously, stuff can change at the drop of a hat. Anything can happen. But at this point, would you expect any of those deals to get done, or is it just too early to tell?
I don't know. Tyler Linderbaum is the one who's really on the clock right now. May 2nd is a deadline for his 5th-year option. As soon as he doesn't get that, he's going to be disappointed, like Patrick Queen was when he didn't get it. But the Ravens, there's no way they're going to give him a $23.4 million thing. It changes the dynamic of the testing to make that guarantee to him. So, not the testing, the negotiation. So they'll have to go through that process. I think it may be it'd be one they'd like to complete by then. And otherwise they could complete by the start of the season. Once the season begins, then every week that clicks off is risk off the player's plate that then becomes divisible benefit loss to the Baltimore Ravens. So they should really try and get that done. The other big one, and maybe more of a big deal to get done by the draft, is a tight end situation. And both extensions for either Andrews, who has 1 more year left on his deal, and Likely, who is in his final year of his rookie deal. Those both, ideally, 1 would be signed and 1 could be moved so they can then draft the tight end, because they don't have any space now on the roster to draft a guy who has any kind of a pedigree. They can draft a 7th or bring in a UDFA, but they can't draft somebody and stick him on the practice squad in the 4th round, say, because he'll be taken away.
Yeah, I think 3 tight ends is that sweet spot where I don't think you want to go over that, at least for the Ravens roster construction. It'd be hard. Now the tight end room is going to look different in some way, shape, or form after this upcoming season. But you want to figure it out sooner rather than later, because with all 3 guys not having deals, you don't know if it's going to be Likely over Andrews over Likely. Do you have a preference, Ken?
I have a very strong preference for value and staggered contracts. Those 2 things combined. So I'm okay trading either one of Andrews or Likely. I'm not ambivalent. Likely is the guy I would prefer to have on the team. I think like most Ravens fans, he's younger, has more of an upside, but he also has more value. So if you can trade him and get more draft value, then that's also exciting.
Yeah. Either way, you have two great tight ends on this roster, and Charlie Kolar obviously as well, the best tight end room in the league, in my opinion. But staying on the offensive side of the ball, Ken, we've seen the Ravens sniff around some offensive line help in the last couple of days here. Let's start with the veteran that I think made waves on the Ravens social media sphere on Tuesday. That is Jeff Rebeck and Joseph Person, The Athletic, reporting that George Fant spoke with Joseph Person, said that he's going to be visiting the Ravens and the Titans. And George Fant ended up saying, quote, there's a couple of other teams I've been talking to, but those two are really intriguing to me. Obviously, Baltimore being a contender and Nashville being where I live at, so I'm definitely interested. Fant is 32 years old. He's had experience playing on both sides, both left and right tackle. Kind of feels like he'd be that Josh Jones type of signing, Ken, if it were to go that way. Do you have any feelings on Fant if the Ravens end up being the team he goes to and what he potentially could bring?
It's nice to have one extra tackle on the roster. Obviously, the Ravens lost two of their three free agent tackles, and they do need another guy. This will probably change the draft landscape a little bit if he's signed, but he's a 1 year. If he comes, he's not going to be a multi-year guy. He's 32 years old. He'll be a 1 year guy, presumably trying to chase a ring, and he's also a guy who doesn't have much in the way of good blocking history in the NFL. I mean, he's played almost 5,000 career snaps. He honestly just has not been very good. The thing he's known for recently is very interesting, but he got a guy through a business he's starting that's trying to identify basketball players who would make good football players. He got Colin Granger a tight end contract, and Colin Granger had played college basketball and is a 6'9" player who he thinks would make a good tight end in the NFL. So it's an interesting business venture. I'd love to talk to him about.
Yeah, that's one of the more unique things that I've heard in the past handful of seasons. And I think there is a market for it. Like there are just college basketball players that would be more focused towards the NFL or have a skill set for the NFL. So that's a really intriguing venture in its own right. If George Fant signs, I think you're right, Ken. It would impact the draft to a degree. Obviously, the Ravens are also sniffing around offensive linemen that could be potential first-round picks. Josh Simmons was one that visited the Ravens on Tuesday. Obviously, Simmons is a heck of a player, but an injury ended his season prematurely, and that obviously has teams wondering about the health situation. And for the Ravens, you mentioned it, Ronnie Stanley was the big get of the offseason. So it's not like the Ravens have an open tackle spot to just plug and play Josh Simmons if it were to be, the Ravens take him at 27. There have been some people to say, could you move him inside to guard, or would he just sit for a year behind Stanley or behind Rosengarten and wait for when Stanley ends up leaving? I don't know if that's the best use of their resources, but is Simmons someone that you would have on your radar for Baltimore 27 if he's available?
See, the at 27, when you threw that in, he's definitely on my radar. He's my number 5 offensive tackle. I think he's a guy who has a good chance to stay there. There's a whole bunch of tackles, as every year, a whole bunch of tackles are going to be moving to the inside. And I left some of them on my tackle list, and I wasn't entirely consistent about it. But Will Campbell, for instance, he's the best offensive lineman in the draft at whatever position he ends up at, probably. But he's a guy who probably has about a 60% chance to be a Pro Bowl or a little bit higher offensive tackle, and he could very well be a Hall of Fame left guard. And it's a question of, it may be a question for him of where does he want to make more money and how he directs his career down the line as soon as he becomes a free agent. But that's an example of a guy who even a player that great, his future is not really understood down the line. Simmons is one of the guys I really like. He's a first or second round pick. I think he's probably a slight reach at 27. I'd rather have him by dropping back and getting him around 35. There's other guys who I like just as much. Josh Connerly is in the same group with him. And then after that, there's kind of a drop off until the rest of the tackles, and kind of hitting round 3 for value with Ariante Ursary and Jonas Sabainaya and Ozzy Trapillo.
Do you think that if the Ravens really want to have that impact on the offensive line, are you okay with them taking a guy they're at 27, like obviously Will Campbell's not going to fall to them. But like if
Right.
there is someone who does fall, and maybe it's not a Simmons because like you said, it might be that sweet spot of a second round pick for him instead of a first.
Mm-hmm.
But if a guy has to sit behind Stanley for a year, if there's a tackle that's worth it to you, is it worth having no value from your first round pick in year one? Or is it okay to have a guy sit behind Stanley for a season, even though Baltimore's competing?
I think there's a third choice. And that's the Ogden choice is you play him at guard for a year and you get him on the field. I column 3 is what I would go for. Get him real NFL snaps. It's not in the position, but it's definitely more value than that. And Stanley is probably going to be in Baltimore for 2 more years. It's really a 2-year, $44 million deal is how I would look at it. If it really works out, he'll play the 3rd year. It may be that he'll need an extension in order to play the 3rd year. So it has a possibility to become an old maid contract on the Ravens. On the other side, you got 3 more years of Rosengarten left before you have to figure out 2 more years before we figure it out. And then 3 more years in Baltimore that he'll play. So there's some question about whether or not he could move to left tackle at some point. But there's guys I'm excited about in this draft. My number 1 guy is Kelvin Banks at left tackle. He's, I think, the best guy who's surely going to stick at left tackle. Whereas, Armand Membu is an exciting player. I don't think he'll drop to 27. If he somehow did, I'd be really curious about the upside. There wouldn't have any problem starting him at guard. And then Connerly and Simmons are the next 2 guys who kind of fit in between round 1 and round 2.
I think there's a lot of trade back value, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit in the second part of the show, because there is a very intriguing conversation between what Baltimore should do. Should they trade up? Should they stay pat? Or should they move back? So be sure to stay tuned. We got plenty coming our way on Locked On Ravens. First, the show is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action right now. When you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. I love how FanDuel makes betting so easy, whether it's picking my favorite team or diving into player props. You got 3-pointers, steals, assists. FanDuel has so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. Been a time for the Denver Nuggets, I'll tell you that. They fire their head coach. They move on from their general manager. And there are still 3 games to go before the playoffs start, so kind of unprecedented. Nuggets face off against the Kings today. And so if you want to maybe go with the Nuggets to win that game over on FanDuel, you know what? Could be an option for you. Or if you want to do Kings outright, I don't blame you, because the Nuggets seem to be in pretty big turmoil right now. Don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. Back on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher, Ken McKusick, still talking Ravens football here. And Ken, I want to continue our conversation about the potential of a trade back for Baltimore. And this goes back to you and I talking on the safety show you and I did a couple of days ago, because there's a player there in Xavier Watts that feels like that is a perfect trade back candidate where Baltimore could recoup some value. I know they already have 11 picks. That's a lot of draft picks. But you could maybe add a 2026 pick onto that, or you could move up in the draft later if you do get more value there. If there's not a guy worth taking at 27 to them, there's just not a guy worth taking at 27. It's going to depend on how the board falls. But do you feel like there is true trade back value in this draft with some of the tackles you talked about, with Xavier Watts and even some other positions as well?
There is. Now, when you drop out of the first round, you lose the 5th-year option on the player, which can have a lot of value. And depending on if Xavier Watts in particular, if you're talking about him, it has good value. That first round draft pick of Watts has good value because the safety number is not too high. If you draft an interior offensive lineman, the 5th round option has no value because you don't want to pay left tackle money for an interior offensive lineman. So it differs a little bit by position group, and Voss is very big on that on a Friday morning GM show in terms of not drafting positions that don't give you some value with that option or provide high value positional skills. So I love the idea of the Ravens getting a safety at the end of the first round. I don't have a problem if the pick goes to Watts. I also don't have a problem if they trade back and try and play a little with fire on getting Watts, because I think there's a lot of other good players they could have. The nice thing about the Ravens, they're set up in this draft with a lot of needs that are of moderate level and none that are like, I got to have them this year or else we're going to fall off a cliff. And that's a really good position to be in. I mean, you have tremendous flexibility moving up or moving down. I think the guy who I'm would be most excited about trading up to get. And this is really only true. He's got to be available at the moment the Ravens make the trade. It's the only way I make this trade. But if you want to move from 27 all the way up to 22, the Barnwell trade that was suggested, where they basically trade pick number 136 and Mark Andrews to move up, and they would also get Zion Johnson, which would be a fantastic catch, by the way, to get a pretty good NFL guard at that point. But if they went from 27 to 22, it's all dependent on who the player they can get at 22 is. And if it were Emin, I'd be very excited about it.
Yeah, a lot of quality players. And I want to dive into going back to the offensive line for a second, because here on the show, I do a mock draft every week. I want to talk about different players, different scenarios, so we're not just repeating the same guy every single week. And this week I did one, didn't get a lot of happy responses, but that's what we do. We try to get good responses, and then we try to go through other scenarios. Trading up or selecting a guy like Tyler Booker, who is not athletic. I don't think he fit. He's not a great scheme fit for what Baltimore has. I think he would fit better somewhere else. Is Tyler Booker a player that you feel like Baltimore, even if he's there at 27, is he someone that you think, despite some of the not great scheme traits that he has for Baltimore, should be on their radar? Or would you rather have that pick go to a tackle you can kick inside for a year or two?
I would not be excited about getting Tyler Booker at 27. It's not that he's not a pretty good player. I just hate drafting guards in round one. A lot of people who listen to my show regularly have heard this story before, but I'll tell it real briefly here. On draft day 2007, we had a little draft party over at our house, and the Ravens were at 29, and it looked like Joe Staley was going to fall into their lap. And in the last moment, San Francisco traded up to number 28, drafted Joe Staley, and the Ravens were left with Ben Grubbs. It's not a terrible outcome. It's not one of these butterfly outcomes where, the world is destroyed in one case and you end up with a bad. It's a good and a great outcome that could have been, and unfortunately, it really it didn't work out for the Ravens that way. I don't like drafting guards in round one. I think it's generally an overvaluation of the position. There's more. It's a larger size and shape pool. And there are a lot of guys who will fail at tackle and have to go to guard. You can get in later rounds because they have 32.5-inch arms, or they have slow feet, or they have other characteristics that just don't make them good tackles. So even though he's a very good offensive lineman, I wouldn't draft him in round one.
I think you also have a lot of guys this year that you can kick inside. Sometimes it varies draft to draft as to how many guys you can have. But again, I think it's easy to kick someone into guard and say, hey, you can play here. And then if we need to bring you back out next season, you can still do that. I know that was a conversation even for a couple of guys the Ravens had on their radar last season at the offensive line position. So I think for Baltimore, there is positional value involved in that. And speaking of, Ken, I know that the Ravens brought in a high riser UCLA inside linebacker who could potentially, he's gotten some potential looks in the late first round, and I think he's a great player. I mean, Carson is a guy that I feel like could make an impact, but the Ravens have Roquan there already. It's not like 2020 when you could argue, yeah, okay, they needed an inside linebacker. Patrick Wiggins slot in as your guy there initially. You can kind of make it work, I feel like, especially if they want to play more dime and just not have two pure inside linebackers on the field. And if they get a safety in the first round, you again have the flexibility to move Kyle Hamilton up. You can play him at a bunch of different positions. Do you think inside linebacker is a position the Ravens should be looking at all on day one or day two? Or do you think that they should try to round it out with more special teams, Chris Board type players, and maybe try to rock with Trent Simpson and see what happens?
I'd go with a later round draft pick. I'd go with a day 3 pick. I think the 4th round is probably the earliest I would consider it, just because I think the other needs are more pressing. I think they need to get younger at cornerback. They desperately need to get a ball hawk safety. So if that opportunity is layered through the draft, but when that opportunity hits and it's at the intersection of need and value street, they need to jump on that. It's much more important than getting the inside linebacker they think is 5% better than the other guys. Schlesinger, I'm not crazy about some things about him. He has a kind of a decent weight, but he's got kind of a very lean frame. I saw some other thing. I don't know exactly. I know how to calculate it, but I don't know why this is a valid measurement. It looks at body surface area for linebackers relative to, I think it was disruptive plays, or I think they called them havoc plays. And he was kind of low on the body surface area measurement, even though he's 6'2" and good weight right around 240, might be 235. But he's a guy who has, I think prototypical linebacker height and weight, but not apparently surface area. And I noticed that this calculation only included height and weight. It didn't include like arm length, which would change your surface area, I would think. So it's kind of a funny thing, but to go through some of the other Schlesinger things, he's not great in every single category. He's potentially a good player. He's certainly on my list of linebackers, but he's a guy I would have hoped would have dropped to a lower round. That may not be the case. He may go in the second round to somebody. Yeah. But if he were available in say the fourth round, I'd probably be excited about it.
Yeah, even if they made a move back in the third and it was a very, very like last pick of the third round draft, like a Brandon Stevens, I could or Tyree Phillips, I think was that last pick, but I could certainly see them working with that. That'd be okay. But at 27, I feel like that's a very far reach, especially with the other positional value needs, like you said, Ken, especially with their edge room too, where I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where it stands right now. I mean, you have Kaveh Miller, you have Odafe Owe. Those are going to be your two big pieces right now. But then you have a lot of wild cards, Tavius Robinson, David Ojabo, Adisa Isaac. There are a lot of quality edge guys in this class, but do you feel like Baltimore has enough as it is, or would you like to see them invest an early pick in that position?
No, they need to get an edge for sure. And they need to get an edge with some upside. And then I think they also need to get a veteran edge. And how I would see it breaking down is that Ojabo is probably gone after doing nothing in 3 years. And David Ojabo, not through any mistake of his own. I mean, the poor guy had his career basically, I think, cut short by an injury that occurred at a combine or pro day testing. I forget which. And he's left a taint on the organization that they're really going to have to NFI players who have significant injury concerns to make sure they get the full value from them. And there's certain players you can do that with, I think, if the injury occurs not during the season. And so pro day and combine testing are impacted by this. There's a lot of players who now don't want to do as much testing at those places. Sometimes it's a matter of they know they won't be good in this particular test. Other times it's a matter of they don't want to take the risk, and their agent is telling them not to. So David Ojabo will have an impact on this organization after they're gone. He already kind of has in terms of the Voorhees contract and him being NFI'd for that first whole year. There are other players that fit into this group, and the big one is Jihad Campbell. Without going back to what you're asking me about edge, but Jihad Campbell is a guy who has a torn labrum now, went through some sort of surgery. I don't know the extent of it. I don't know. I don't think we will know by the draft. But I tell you what, it takes him out of the first round for me. I couldn't put a first round grade on the guy, and I know he's thought to be a consensus top 10 or top 15 pick, but I can't do it.
There's so much when it comes to some of these prospects and a couple of different things within their skill set. Okay, look. He brings a lot of good things to the table, but there are these one or two things for a lot of these players where you're like, I just don't know if I can get on board. I just don't know if that can be, you overlook all this good stuff for a couple of bad. And you hate to do it that way because, there's so much talent in these guys. But one little thing can set off a whole chain reaction, it feels like, Ken. But coming up in the final part of the show, we'll talk about some of the other Baltimore moves they've made this offseason, have impacted their draft strategy, and what those moves mean for the players already on the roster. So be sure to stay tuned. Locked On Ravens. We're right back. First, this show is brought to you by Chewy. You've probably heard of Chewy. They really do have everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. Whether you're shopping for food, treats, or even pet healthcare, Chewy makes it fast, easy, and affordable. With over 100,000 products from all your favorite brands, Chewy has everything your pet needs, from food and treats to toys, beds, and grooming. It's not just for dogs and cats. They've got supplies for birds, fish, reptiles, and small pets too. Chewy also makes it easy to manage your pet's health with prescriptions, telehealth, vet visits, and even in-person vet clinics rolling out nationwide. The Chewy customer service team is great to interact with, and Chewy makes managing pet care easier. Never running out of essentials. You have easy access to vet care, and everything is delivered to your door. Chewy has everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. Right now, you can save $20 on your first order and get free shipping by going to chewy.com and clicking the link in the description. Save $20 on your first order with free shipping by clicking the link in the description. Minimum purchase required, new customers only. Certain conditions apply. See site for complete details. Again, minimum purchase required, new customers only. Terms and conditions apply. See site for complete details. Locked On Ravens with Ken McKusick. I am Kevin Oestreicher, still diving into the latest Ravens talk. Obviously, offensive line being a position where Baltimore's sniffing around, George Fant, Josh Simmons. But Ken, the Ravens have made a couple of additions this offseason, DeAndre Hopkins being one of them at the wide receiver position. I think wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 3, he is an upgrade over Nelson Aguilar. He is not the DeAndre Hopkins of Houston. He also, I think I see people comparing it to the Odell Beckham Jr. signing. In terms of money, at least, this is $10 million cheaper than Odell signed for, which is a massive deal. Because I remember, Ken, when you and I talked about that a couple of years ago, it was a huge overpay for the player that Odell was at that time in his career. I think that if you limit DeAndre, I don't want to say limit, but if you give DeAndre the proper role, he's not going to be asked to be the number one guy, assuming everyone stays healthy. I feel a lot more confident if Isaiah Rashod has to miss time. You can have DeAndre Hopkins slot into a role. Do you feel like this is a move that takes the Ravens wide receiver group to the next level in terms of depth, or do you think that it's just an appropriate depth signing that can have that has a higher ceiling than Odell did?
Appropriate depth signing. I don't know that it has a higher ceiling than Odell did. Odell ended up playing reasonably well for the Ravens,
sure.
Pretty good yards per target and whatnot. It's just that it was no way matched up with the contract he was given. That was the problem. In the case of Hopkins, I think a lot of this is on him, and I hope Hopkins will be the antithesis of Deontay Johnson, who was a spoiled guy who was coming up on a contract. It was real important to him to make money. And he got basically kicked off 4 teams in the course of about 12 months between the Steelers, the Panthers, the Ravens, and then Houston, and then re-signed by the Ravens for purely the value in terms of a compensatory offset. But it's just with Hopkins, he's got to be. There are 2 things I want him to be. The first is I want him to be a leader. I want him to accept whatever role that he has. It's a Jackson-led offense, so nobody's ever happy with their targets, and that's just tough crap if you come to the Ravens. You get less because a lot more of the offense runs through Lamar Jackson, and there's far fewer passing plays because the Ravens are so good, they're always closing out games. So if you want great, fantasy stats, go play for Arizona. Go play for another team that is habitually down in games, and see if you can make it there. But so DeAndre's going to have a lower numbers across the board, I'm sure. I need to see him be good with that, and I need to also see him be an enthusiastic, and not only enthusiastic, a leader in terms of run blocking. He's got the frame for it, he's got the feet for it, and he just needs to apply himself. And he was early in his career, he's pretty good, and now he's not anymore. And that needs to be corrected. I think largely is a case of effort in his case.
I feel like hopefully the motivation of being on the Ravens playing with Lamar will help. Now, I guess you could say the same thing about being on the Chiefs, because they went to the Super Bowl. So we know Hopkins is a competitor, and hopefully that will come out in Baltimore, but he's going to be asked to do a lot more of that than he was in Kansas City. It's a different offense. So I think for DeAndre with Zay and Rashod there, it makes up a very good wide receiver trio, especially if DeAndre in a more limited role, I will say limited, hopefully he can stay healthy, because he really hasn't been healthy in 3 of the past 4 seasons. I know he played the majority of the games last year, but he had the knee injury that he got in training camp with Tennessee that I think pretty much hindered him for most of the year last season. So hopefully it's just a fresh slate of health. He'll be able to come in and make an impact. But speaking of health, Ken, Chidobe Awuzie has had his own struggles with health over the course of his career. Obviously, Ravens are familiar with him. Played in Cincinnati for a couple of seasons, was one of the best corners, or at least he was a much better corner than he was in Dallas in Cincinnati before his ACL tear. I think it's a depth signing. It works. It feels like a Ravens signing, especially the fact that he was cut and the Ravens don't have to factor that into their compensatory pick formula. And the corner market really wasn't flush after the first week with a ton of talent. I know people were talking about Jair Alexander. That wasn't really realistic unless he was cut from Baltimore. So for you, Ken, was Chidobe Awuzie a signing that you could kind of see coming, at least that type of signing for Baltimore?
Yeah, it was a good signing, and it's a subtle value move, because Chidobe Awuzie is going to make $7.5 million from the Tennessee Titans this next year, and there's offset language in his contract. So whatever he makes for the Ravens is just deducted from the Titans' obligation to him. So neither Awuzie nor the Ravens are incented to make that contract anything more than the vet minimum, and that's what they've done. So if you compare him, I think the key player who's kind of in the other hand, or the other part of the other half of the scale, is Trey White. And I think it was either him or Trey White. Trey White, I think the Ravens probably would have had to give between 1 and 3 million as a base, and then some incentives to go with that. But there's nobody offsetting what he makes in salary. So White probably ends up costing you 2 or 2.5 times what Awuzie does. And even though I might believe that White would be as good as Awuzie or approximately as good, Awuzie was actually pretty good last year, by the way. If he were about as good, it's still a right player, right price situation. So subtle move, very smart, kind of like the Michael Pierce thing where they are going to have him retire after 6-1 to preserve their post June 1 releases. It's the special designation ones. It's just very, very smart management of that cap being done all the way through, and it extends the football operations on a move like Awuzie for White.
It's interesting because it almost reminds me a bit of the Russell Wilson situation last year where the Broncos were paying all that salary to Russell Wilson, and Russ essentially said, hey, I want to go somewhere where I'm going to have an opportunity and can compete, and he's not really worried about the money. And so for Awuzie, if he can come into Baltimore, he's getting paid by Tennessee, gets the extra bonus from Baltimore, and then he has a pretty good season, he could parlay that maybe into a bigger contract, which obviously helps the Ravens out when it comes to compensatory pick stuff. So I think it would be a win-win for everybody. But you mentioned Michael Pierce. I think obviously out of all the losses, at least to me, Ken, he's the biggest one. You talk about McCary, Stevens, etc. I mean, they're going to miss him on the interior. And interior defensive line is a pretty underrated need. I think I don't really see a ton of people talking about it, but it's Nnamdi Madubuike, Travis Jones, who are, again, your two staples there. And then Broderick Washington, who hasn't really shown a ton since the extension has come down his way. How big are you into them getting maybe even 2 defensive linemen in this class because it is so deep?
Yeah, I'm enormously. I think this is the year to strike on the defensive line. We've been through a series of years here that included the COVID years that has had a long tail in keeping the population of good defensive linemen down. And players took a year off. A lot of them, some at the NFL level, like Pierce, took a year off. But others have. It's just been a very slow move through the snake in terms of when they get to the NFL draft. Well, this year finally got just a bumper crop of interior defensive linemen, including some fantastically extreme players. The Florida has a 464-pound defensive lineman who will be available in this draft. Who, as soon as he steps on the field, will be the heaviest player in NFL history. Outweighs Daniel Faalele by approximately 100 pounds. I mean, that's just insane to me. But and he's to my way of thinking, he is definitely a guy the Ravens should consider either as a 7 or a UDFA. He's not a fake prospect. Somebody may draft him as a 5. I mean, it could be that extreme, but there are a bunch of guys at the top of the draft that are quite good. And the problem is fit with the Ravens because the Ravens really need a pure nose, or they could take a combo guy who's a 1-3 like Brandon Williams was. But there are a fair number of pure noses that would work for them, who would be an early down guy. The guys that they won't get as much value from, and I don't think they can afford to take, are guys who are high value pass rush 3 techs. And those guys, somebody else is going to find more value because those snaps are largely already taken by Madubuike, and getting him on the field, getting that kind of a player on the field would be difficult. So I'd like them to get one for sure. If it's a really good one, re-sign Brent Urban, I'm fine. If it's a really good one and they get a second, that's kind of more of a trial player, somebody to get in a later round, that's fine too. It's a great draft. They can't miss out completely. They can't whiff completely on this class.
Yeah, I'd be pretty devastated if they did based off of how many talented players. I mean, there are going to be multiple Travis Jones situations, I feel like, this year where Jones was projected by some to go in the late first round and the Ravens get him in the middle of the third, and people are wondering, well, how did this happen? This draft is an even more extreme version of that, where you're going to see multiple, and especially with some of the combines and pro days these guys had, they've jumped from 5th rounders to 2nd rounders, and that's just how deep this class is. So if Baltimore decides to go with maybe a Derrick Harmon in round 1, or maybe they go Darius Alexander in round 2, like there are going to be all across the board really quality players at that position. And so if Baltimore decides that there's an edge they like in round 1, they can still get a good defensive lineman in round 2 or in round 4. And that guy might go in the 2nd round if we're talking about last year's class, because that's just how deep it actually is. So a lot of big decisions for Baltimore to make. Ken, appreciate you as always for hopping on, talking football with me. Always a blast. As always, tell people where they can find you and what you're working on. I know you're busy this time of year.
Sure, of course. I'm at Film Study Ravens on Twitter. The website is filmstudybaltimore.com. That's where you can find the podcast, the articles during the regular season. Right now, the podcast is all draft focused. So we're going through one position group at a time. Kevin was on one recently regarding the safeties. It's 2 hours of highly concentrated 10-1 countdown on one position. A lot of very specific considerations we went to in stacking our boards as we did, and it's kind of a comparison between two different people who think a little differently about the players. The next one I'll be recording tonight is the interior defensive line, and the next one that's going to be out is the inside linebackers, which will be out on Wednesday and Thursday of this week. The tight ends was out today.
All the links to Ken's work in the description down below. Highly recommend checking it out. And again, if you want to go back, listen to the safety breakdown or any of the others that Ken is doing with, again, a bunch of great Ravens and NFL content creators, be sure to check him out. So Ken, appreciate you as always. And thank you to everybody for watching and listening to Locked On Ravens today. Of course, we'll be back here tomorrow, still talking Ravens football, still talking Ravens drafts on the way. Hit the like and subscribe button in video form and follow along and subscribe in audio form. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.